built a food culture that still feeds America today. These weren't just meals, they were survival. Every dish carried pain, resilience, and a story that most history books leave out. In this video, we're uncovering 25 survival foods of slaves on plantations. The forgotten meals that kept people alive through one of the darkest chapters in history. And the hidden roots of dishes still on our tables today. Stick around, because some of these will shock you. 1. Parched corn, toasted dried kernels. When hunger hit hard in the fields, there wasn't always a pot or fire to cook a meal. That's where parched corn came in. Enslaved people would toast dried kernels until they browned and popped with flavor. It was portable, it was filling, and it could last for weeks without spoiling. Think of it as their original trail mix, except it wasn't for hiking trips, it was for survival. Parched corn gave enough energy to push through backbreaking work, and sometimes it was all a person had to eat for an entire day. Fast forward to today, and you'll see echoes of it in kettle corn at a fair, or the roasted corn nuts sold in gas stations. But for those living on plantations, this wasn't a snack, it was life or death. And here's the twist. This simple survival food didn't just keep people alive, it became the seed of Southern food traditions that we still taste today. But what happened when the corn ran out? The answer was another dish so plain, so bare bones, it shocked even visiting outsiders. 2. Boiled cornmeal mush. If parched corn was the pocket food of survival, then cornmeal mush was the hot meal that kept folks going at night. Just cornmeal, water, and salt, boiled until it thickened into a heavy porridge. No milk, no butter, none of the extras we throw in today. Just enough to quiet an empty stomach. This dish was so common, it showed up in slave narratives again and again. Sometimes it was ladled into wooden troughs where children would gather around with spoons, eating side by side like piglets at a pen. Brutal, humbling, but it kept them alive. Here's the part that sticks. Mush wasn't just dinner. Cold leftovers were sliced and fried the next day, turning into something closer to polenta cakes. That simple stretch, boiling once, frying twice, doubled the food supply and saved scraps that might have gone to waste. Fast forward to today, and you'll still see its shadow in Southern fried cornmeal cakes, or even Italian polenta fries on restaurant menus. But for the enslaved, mush was survival stripped bare, plain, heavy, and unforgettable. 3. Turnip greens stew. When scraps of meat were scarce, and they almost always were, enslaved families turned to the earth itself. Turnip greens, those bitter leaves most folks tossed aside, became the backbone of survival stews. Boiled soft, seasoned with nothing more than a pinch of salt, or maybe a scrap of pork fat if you were lucky. This wasn't comfort food. It was endurance food. But here's the thing. Greens carried more than just calories. They gave strength. They filled the belly with warmth when winter winds cut through thin clothes in bare cabins. A pot of turnip greens simmering on a fire wasn't just food. It was hope stretched into a meal. Over time, that bitter, earthy flavor became familiar, even cherished. Families passed down ways to soften the bite. Slow cooking, mixing in roots, adding in whatever scraps they could. And that tradition echoes loud today. Walk into a Southern kitchen and you'll still see pots of greens on the stove, collards, mustards, or turnips, seasoned up and served with. But for the enslaved, it started with survival, not taste. A stew made of leaves, stalks, and scraps most people wouldn't touch. 4th, cowpea stew. Long before black-eyed peas were a New Year's tradition, they were a survival food on the plantations. Enslaved Africans carried knowledge of cowpeas with them across the ocean. Hardy beans that grew well in the southern heat and poor soil. Cheap, filling, and packed with protein, they were a lifeline when meat was just a memory. Cowpea stew was simple. Boil the beans soft, add a little salt, maybe toss in a scrap of pork rind if you had it. Sometimes it simmered with wild herbs or onions from the fields, but more often it was just beans and water, plain, heavy, and sustaining. But here's the powerful twist. Cowpeas weren't just survival food, they were a taste of home. For many enslaved people, this was one of the few foods that tied them back to Africa, where cowpeas had been cooked for generations in stews and porridges. Eating them wasn't just filling the belly, it was holding onto a piece of identity in a world trying to erase it. And today, that legacy is alive every time black-eyed peas are served with rice or simmered into hop and john. What started as a survival stew is now a symbol of luck, prosperity, and Southern tradition. But survival wasn't always planted or grown. Sometimes it was plucked straight from the dirt and boiled down into something barely edible. 5. Dandelion greens, boiled soft. When you think of dandelions today, you probably picture weeds in the yard, something to spray or pull out. But for enslaved families, those so-called weeds were a gift from the earth. Dandelion greens grew wild, needed no planting, and filled pots when nothing else was left. Boiled soft, the greens lost some of their bitterness, though not all. Sometimes they were flavored with a splash of vinegar, maybe a sliver of fat, but most days it was just greens and water. A thin broth, a chewy bite, and just enough to take the edge off hunger. Here's the hidden beauty. Dandelions carried nutrients, iron, vitamins, strength. Even if plantation owners didn't know or care, enslaved cooks understood that these weeds were more than filler. They were survival medicine, and this survival food didn't fade away. In parts of the South, dandelion greens were eaten well into the 20th century, and today they've circled back as a trendy superfood in fancy restaurants and health stores. Imagine that. What was once desperation food now sells for $5 a bundle. But if bitter weeds could become a meal, imagine what happened when the rare sweetness of sugar trickled into enslaved hands. 6. Molasses water, sweet ration drink. Sugar was money on the plantations, and enslaved people rarely tasted it. But every so often, they'd be given a ration of molasses. Thick, dark, sticky. It wasn't candy, but it was sweet, and that sweetness meant everything. The simplest way to make it last? Stir a spoonful into a tin cup of water. That was molasses water, a poor man's energy drink. It gave quick calories, a burst of sweetness in a life where flavor was almost always bitter. For children, that cup was a rare treat. For adults, it was fuel, enough to push through another day in the fields. Sometimes it doubled as medicine too, mixed with herbs to soothe coughs or settle the stomach. What's wild is how much this echoes forward. Molasses water was survival, but it was also the seed of Southern desserts, barbecue sauces, and baked goods we love today. That sticky sweetness shaped the flavor of an entire region. But if molasses was rare gold, the next food was the opposite. Scraps so unwanted that plantation owners tossed them aside. And yet, enslaved cooks turned them into a meal that still stirs debate today. 7. Salt pork scraps, fried or boiled. Meat was a luxury enslaved people almost never saw, unless it was the parts nobody else wanted. That's where salt pork scraps came in. Plantation owners kept the hams, chops, and roasts, while the fat trimmings, rinds, and scraps went to the slave quarters. Fried in a pan, those scraps released grease that seasoned everything from beans to greens. Boiled, they became chewy bites in a pot of stew. And when there wasn't even meat left, just the fat, enslaved cooks saved every drop, stretching it to flavor cornmeal mush or bitter greens. Here's the hard truth. Salt pork was never meant to be a gift. It was cheap, preserved, and considered unfit for proper tables. But in the hands of enslaved people, it became a cornerstone of survival cooking. That salty, smoky flavor carried through entire meals, making scraps taste like feasts. And the legacy? You can still taste it today. Southern soul food, from collard greens simmered with ham hock to fried cabbage with bacon, traces back to those scraps. What was once cast off has become comfort, but meat scraps weren't the only thing enslaved cooks strength. 25. Wild onion and garlic soup, thin broth. Out in the fields and woods, enslaved families foraged not just for greens and fruit, but for the sharp bite of wild onions and garlic. These hardy plants grew along ditches and forest edges, and when boiled into water, they made a thin, pungent soup. It wasn't hearty. Most times it was just broth, clear, light, and flavored only by those wild bulbs. But in a life of constant hunger, even that thin soup carried power. The sulfur-rich plants helped fight off sickness, cleared the chest, and gave a sense of warmth when bellies were otherwise empty. Children might sip it like medicine, while adults drank it to stretch through long nights. And when scraps of salt pork or fat were added, if any could be spared, the soup turned into something closer to a real meal. Here's the legacy. Today, onions and garlic are the backbone of nearly every cuisine in the world. But for the enslaved, their wild cousins weren't just flavor, they were survival. A bitter broth that carried bodies through the hardest days. And with that, we come full circle. From roasted corn to bitter greens,